the pandemic will be over when the Emergency Powers Act is repealed and all these restrictions are completely rolled back, including the mask mandate for toddlers in New York City, children 2 to 4 years old. This is having absolutely no effect on slowing the spread. It is a perception management device and a political tool of Eric Adams, being weaponized against the most vulnerable population in New York in a developmental phase where they're forced to wear completely useless cloth masks in order to make their parents feel safe, because they can't be given 3 micrograms of mRNA, which also fail to stop infection or transmission against a virus for which these small children have almost no risk of hospitalization or death from. So it's absurd. This is still taking place around the country. The state assembly in California has a whole bevy of draconian bills that are being debated right now. The U.S. People's Convoy has left its base outside Washington, D.C. for Sacramento, had left it several weeks ago to protest those bills. One bill would strip doctors of their medical licenses if they sought to treat COVID with off-patent medications, or if they said anything to patients that cut against the grain of the completely discredited consensus that Fauci and the CDC attempted to enforce for the past 2 years. So this is an attack on the speech of doctors. And you can just look at the bills and the extreme mandates that they're proposing. Same thing in the New York state legislature. So this is still taking place. Philadelphia reinstated a mask mandate. There's still a debate going on. What changed was that on February 24th, Vladimir Putin ended the pandemic as the current thing. In other words, as the kind of psychological operation that US media and government bureaucrats were keeping the public preoccupied with and using to manipulate them. It was no longer the deep political event that it had been. And you can make it may be that the Ukraine proxy war is no longer the current thing after the leak of a draft decision by Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito last night, which saw hundreds of protesters outside the Supreme Court, including members of anti-war groups, which haven't protested the Ukraine proxy war to any significant degree. I was just in Los Angeles in California to speak at the rally against the mandates there. And my speech is on the Gray Zone channel. It's funny how people who attack me for going there, members of the lockdown left and establishment liberals, don't actually quote my speech or quote from anything I said. But one of the main objectives of my speech, in addition to speaking out against censorship and how it was expanded and reinforced against the backdrop of COVIDian hysteria and now being applied to anti-war voices, was to call for the reinstatement of the jobs of public workers doing the most important jobs in this country who were fired because they didn't want to take an experimental gene therapy. And that's exactly what the vaccine was. And I hung out with them. I've known them, firefighters in New York who are protesting for their jobs back. They're very healthy people. They're doing just fine. They didn't suffer a winter of death and severe illness as Joe Biden said they would. They want to assist their communities. They want to rescue people, public school teachers. A friend of mine, he's faculty at a public college. He lost his job because he wouldn't take the jab. He's lost his health insurance. Relying on I did an interview with him. His name is Garrett Ramirez, longtime socialist organizer, union organizer, someone you can never call far right. And I noticed in the interview, his glasses were taped together with electrical tape. And it was because he couldn't pay to get his glasses fixed because he'd lost his health insurance. So that's what these people are going through. It continues under the reign of the clown mayor, Eric Adams, who showed up at the Met Gala with a ridiculous Gilded Age costume on, calling for stopping gun violence. This is a former cop. And so for people to say that it's not happening, is just a way of continuing to gaslight us. The same people that gaslit us and made us think that, the vaccine was going to wipe out the pandemic and this was just like polio. They're now just claiming that the mandates don't exist. And yes, they were rolled back for political reasons, but people are not getting their jobs back. There's no accountability for the lying. You can see what Fauci's out there doing now. He said that a federal judge's decision is not valid because the judge is not a medical expert like him and the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, who said that she learned about vaccine efficacy from watching CNN because she lied about the efficacy of the vaccines. She misinformed the public. She misinformed the public about whether they would stop transmission when we knew that they wouldn't from the beginning. And Fauci is saying that he shouldn't be bound by any federal court order. He's also acting like he is above the law that he tried to enforce through fiat, an unelected bureaucrat who was one of the highest paid and longest serving federal bureaucrats, maybe the highest paid. When Washington, D.C. lifted its mask mandate for a few weeks, right before Omicron hit, Fauci denounced the mayor, who was actually elected. I'm not a big fan of hers, but she was actually elected here. He denounced her. He doesn't even live in D.C. He lives in the suburbs, and said that, this is going to cause massive death. Fauci was seen at the Met Gala posing with Don Lemon, maskless, while masked servants at the White House Press Correspondents Association dinner, maskless with Don Lemon, while masked servants catered to them. So the hypocrisy is very clear. And Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, was asked about Fauci parading around maskless while he's waited on by masked servants, the kind of people who have to obey the mandates that he metes out through just his own orders without any public referendum. And Jen Psaki said, this is a private decision. And so what she's saying is that for Fauci and people of his class, they do not have to obey the mandates that the rest of us do. Bill Gates is never going to need a vaccine passport. Bill Gates may never want to take a booster, but people who want to work as firefighters and teachers and frontline, rescue workers, they do. And so we can see the class division very clearly here. But it's funny that the right tend to be the only ones talking about this. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and the censorship struggles then, or the anti-censorship struggles then, were generally advanced by liberals against, for example, the Parents Music Resource Center. I don't know if you remember that. It was formed in 1985, had backing from the right-wing Coors family, and was fronted by Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore. Basically, it was a bunch of elite Washington wives, kind of the original Karens, who were very troubled about rap music and the hip hop culture becoming commercialized and starting to reach the suburbs. And they were worried white kids were going to be corrupted by it. C. Dolores Tucker, who was involved in the civil rights struggle, got involved in it because she was upset about the impact on Black culture. And there were some legitimate critiques of, violent gangster rap and how it was being marketed by white millionaires like David Geffen, for example. But basically what they wanted to do was limit the First Amendment severely. And it came down to a very dramatic Senate hearing where Frank Zappa, one of my heroes, who was a lifelong civil libertarian, stood up against them and made the case that this would not be limiting simply lyrics about, lascivious sexual content, lascivious sexual acts. It was a slippery slope towards limiting the First Amendment completely and destroying artistic expression in the United States. And he completely exposed the hypocrisy of figures like Tipper Gore, who claimed to be liberal. And it was a really signal moment. Of course, there were business interests that were against censorship, but that was kind of what I grew up on, was that kind of civil libertarian spirit, which allowed the wide dissemination of the music and the soundtrack of a people who had been oppressed and ghettoized. And now here we are. And the main advocates for censorship tend to be liberals and the kind of people that I think might have stood up against the censorship of the 80s and 90s. What's going on here? The issue is that they are afraid of the American public. They're not afraid of one particular faction, although there is a faction that they define as populist, but they're afraid of the American public in general. And they blame Russia for unleashing the monster of Donald Trump, which was so embarrassing for them. Just 4 years of Trump humiliating them in front of the White House press corps, jousting with them, then them being embarrassed and humiliated by Trump on the world stage, Trump having summits with the North Korean leader, Trump having summits with Vladimir Putin. Of course, Russia was a convenient boogeyman, and that many of them were just being cynical. They know that Russia didn't win the 2016 election for Trump. For the most part, this kind of class of Washington apparatchiks and coastal intelligentsia cadres believe their own bullshit. And so they're trying to institute a form of censorship that does not meet the same kind of resistance that the Parents Music Resource Center did, because the Parents Music Resource Center was actually calling for legislating limits on speech. What is taking place right now is much slicker in a sense, but also very clumsy, because you can see with the appointment of Nina Jankowicz, the whoever appointed her, I guess it was Mayorga or whoever runs the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know who selected her, but they actually think she's an expert. We'll talk about her in a second. I think it's really important, if you want to understand what the agenda here is with disinformation and censorship, is to watch Barack Obama's speech at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, where he's speaking to young people who are basically being trained and funded to implement the kind of censorship agenda that will be censorship without censorship, we can call it. Obama said, I am a radical civil libertarian. Like, I'm a free speech absolutist. So he doesn't believe in illegalizing certain forms of speech or suing people, having the federal government sue people for what they've said, like the Parents Music Resource Center. What he wants to do, and he said it right there, it took forever for him to get to the point. At about the 45-minute mark in his speech, he said that he wants the algorithms that social media uses to amplify certain speech and limit other speech to be open, but not to be open to the public, not to be open to me and you are limited by that algorithm. He wants it to be open to those young people in that room who are basically national security or cybersecurity drones, and then they will get to determine the algorithm. And he called this reform. Those people, he kept saying we need to reform social big tech and social media platforms. He didn't call to nationalize it or to break them up, as even Steve Bannon and Donald Trump did. And that's because by reforming it, and he said we need more government involvement, not more popular or democratic involvement, which is what would take place through nationalization. Those people in that room who are just completely politically conformist, centrist, cybersecurity, national security drones will be in charge. And then he also proposed having consultant roles for NGOs that are backed by the Obama Foundation, which is itself backed by corporate America and the national security establishment. And those NGOs will be fronted by Obama fellows who are, many of them are people of color, who will serve as self-appointed representatives of their communities without any accountability to their communities. And they will therefore limit what traditionally restive, oppressed communities in the US can hear and see, and determine what's disinformation or not. So I think Obama is actually the person who's far more dangerous than Nina Jankowicz. Obama's the salesman for all this. I'm pretty sure, I mean, if we look at his record after being president, he's being paid to do this. I mean, he was getting $400,000 to give speeches for hedge funds. So I assume he's getting paid to be the disinformation frontman. But there's also a clear benefit for Obama. I mean, Obama is responsible for the disaster that we're in with Joe Biden. He's the one who engineered the Democratic primary so that his vice president would emerge as the nominee. And, he call Buttigieg, hey, we're going to get you transportation secretary. If you drop out, you're all going to be good. We're all going to take care of you. If you all drop out, and then just leave it as a contest between Biden and Bernie, and then we'll crush Bernie in South Carolina. So Obama's responsible for all that. Obama's essentially the captain of the Democratic Party. So why doesn't Obama, what can Obama do to take his influence to the next level? He gains control not over the presidency, not over US foreign policy, but over the way that reality is officially interpreted and regulated by the government, and specifically by the national security state. And it becomes regulated according to his worldview, which is, I think Obama defines where the political center is. So you have like these little bureaucrats being put in charge of implementing these sorts of policies. It's going to take years and years for them to get this through, and it will also require them not having a Trump-like figure in the White House. That's going to stall things, even though there were already sort of subsidiaries within the Department of Homeland Security that were combating what they call disinformation and defining what is true and false. So they bring out Nina Jankowicz. Who is she and what does she want? That was sort of irrelevant to whoever appointed her, because she apparently had been really successful at marketing herself and networking behind the scenes. I mean, it would be really funny to know how she wound up getting this job. She's younger than me, but she's managed to emerge as kind of an influential attack dog for the Democratic Party and defender. And she's helped them refine this language of disinformation, but she's also, as we can see, a complete and total clown who's extremely reckless. Let's just go through her history really quickly. She, I think, was in Ukraine advising the government on a Fulbright scholarship, which really highlights how neoliberal this government is and how similar it is to the post-1973 government of Chile, where basically all of its opponents are disappeared, tortured, assassinated, and US advisors are brought in to ram through austerity policies and to Americanize and colonize Ukraine. She was sort of riding that gravy train, getting experience there. Then she gets a fellowship at the Wilson Center, which is a US government funded, they call it a public policy center in Washington, DC. It's a think tank that tends to trend democratic. And she was also working at the National Democratic Institute, which is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the US government. The NDI was headed for decades by Madeleine Albright, and they would come in and train activists and civil society figures to advance regime change operations from Libya to Tunisia to Venezuela. So she was involved there. She is a regime change fanatic, which led her to really take an antagonistic line towards the gray zone. The news outlet, and I've found it, I mean, I take it as a badge of honor that she was attacking us. But if you look at the attacks on us, she is falsely branding us as part of a Russian disinformation operation. I mean, she's so desperate to censor us. She's so desperate, and she called us dangerous disinformation or damaging disinformation, which makes me feel good. I mean, I'm glad that we're damaging her cause, which is to spread imperialism and topple elected governments around the world that don't align with the imperial agenda. I take that as a compliment, but it also shows that someone who wants to censor us, who wants to eliminate us, essentially, who's libeling us as part of a Russian disinformation operation, has now been appointed with law enforcement powers at an agency that was created out of the post 9/11 war on terror hysteria to crack down on terrorism. That is outrageous, and it needs to be shut down. It needs to be investigated. We need to know what they're spending their money on. There's no transparency. There's just this culture among liberals and in liberal media, including at outlets I used to write for, like the Daily Beast. I wrote for them for like a year, where journalists, their job is essentially to go after those who are spreading disinformation and to demand that the manager in big tech shut them down. That's just what journalists do these days. It's amazing. I mean, there's an entire field that's been created for journalists to do this. And so it's considered legitimate. Censorship is considered legitimate in this fight against disinformation, because information is not only seen by people like Nina Jankowicz as a weapon that can be used to undermine US national security, but speech itself, if left unregulated and unsuppressed, is seen by left liberals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, someone who presumably would have stood up against the anti-rap censorship campaigns of the 80s and 90s, as a gateway to an explosion of hate crimes. AOC said this several days ago, that if Elon Musk takes over Twitter and allows, and skews Twitter, what she's saying is he doesn't censor as much, there will be an explosion of hate crimes. There's no evidence for that whatsoever, but it shows you how everyone from the center right of Mitt Romney to the kind of rad lib left of AOC views speech, the speech of the American people, the American populace, unrestricted, as potentially violent, dangerous, and existentially destructive to the United States. I mean, anyone watching this can understands how outrageous it is just by your question, and how, I guess I would say, how coordinated it all is. I mean, it's all coming at once in this tidal wave, and it all followed Obama's disinformation speech at Stanford. That kind of kicked it off. I don't know how it's being coordinated, but that guy, I can't even remember his name, who wrote the Daily Beast article. I mean, he's been hounding me for years. He's one of those kind of left liberal types who loves U.S. foreign policy because he sees it as protecting Uyghurs from genocide and so on. And he was desperate for thirsting for regime change in Syria. What we're doing, why we're being targeted, is we're doing what the anti-war movement in the US has always done, which is to expose the disinformation of the national security state and the war state, and how it stimulates support among the American public for regime change through often bogus atrocity exhibitions, like what we saw in Syria in Duma in April 2018, with a staged event alleging a chemical attack when none took place, according to Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons inspectors that were part of the fact-finding mission. And what was obvious to the entire critical-minded public, we're being punished for basically being critical thinkers and being willing to say that the government is lying to us to get us to support military interventions now in Ukraine. And the consequences are devastating. So it's nothing new. It's just a lot more intense. And what I get, I mean, you didn't mention the NewsGuard, this NewsGuard review of the gray zone, where we were contacted by a Pentagon and State Department and Big Pharma funded media rating site whose board of directors is a grotesque gallery of war criminals and spooks and corporate shills in government. And they said that they wanted to ask us a few questions, and know who is behind our site, who the owner is, and basically, investigate us. And then they would give us a green or red rating. And then their ratings go out on all Microsoft library computers and into public schools and so on. Which is part, I can go into that. That's part of the sort of counter disinformation agenda, is to, prevent public school students from gaining access to alternative media. But leaving that aside, I just wrote them a scathing note and told them to go fuck themselves. And Tucker Carlson read it out on his show 2 nights ago. And I just got a flood of supportive emails. People are not buying the government's definition of disinformation, just as people are not buying the government's line on Ukraine. I mean, you can even see in polls, at least the British public has been polled on whether they support sanctioning, harsh sanctions on Russia. And initially they did, but now that they see that it's costing them their economic livelihood, I mean, none of it's working. It's what I was saying before, and maybe I was a little too long-winded, but the Democrats are losing. They have a lot of influence within the professional managerial class, which means they have influence within the intelligence apparatus, because that's where people come from. They come from Stanford and the Harvard Kennedy School or Johns Hopkins SAIS or whatever. They have influence in those institutions, and they're using it to try to shut down the speech of their political opponents because they can't win over the American public. The American public doesn't want to mask 2-year-old kids. The American public didn't. Look at what happened in Virginia with the governor's race. I mean, in a solid blue state, Virginia isn't even a purple state anymore. It's a solid blue state. And Glenn Youngkin, who is a very strong candidate, I mean, just as a retail politician, a very strong candidate, but he kind of came out of nowhere against a former governor, heavily funded governor. And his closing message to the Virginia public was not, we need to restore white supremacy or something. It was that shutting down our public schools during the pandemic cost our youth in reading, math, and all academic achievement, especially among Black and underprivileged youth, including disabled youth who are in special education programs. That was his closing message. It came out in the form of an op-ed in Fox News. That's what's going on. The public has rejected all of that, and the Democrats are using their influence within the professional managerial class that's insulated from what's been taking place in public schools, and also war hungry because they have skin in the imperial game. The economy here in DC runs on military Keynesianism and the intelligence spending and contracts, and they're leaning on them to try to shut down their opponents without an election. It's the most undemocratic thing I've witnessed, and their cover for the whole campaign is that the other side, if we don't do this, the other side will spread hate and hate crimes and racism and fascism. Well, how many anti-war leftists or anti-war voices have been booted off Twitter? Were they spreading hate and racism? No, they were just standing up against the empire that the PMC is so invested in. And by the way, what is Biden being asked to do to fire up the Democratic base ahead of the midterm elections? He's being asked to cancel student debt. And like, yeah, fine, that would be great. But who has student debt? It's a lot of people with advanced degrees, people who are the professional managerial class. So whether you're for it or against it, it really speaks to who the Democratic base is. And they're asking the working class to subsidize that. So the right has, made that point. My point is, all of those imperial institutions that are crafting these policies should be expropriated and nationalized, and their endowments should be used to cancel student debt for working class students. Yeah, I've been meaning today to write PayPal and ask why they're doing that. I don't know if any journalists are writing them. I know Matt Taibbi's working on a story about this, so I know he'll do his due diligence, but PayPal hasn't given an explanation. And I know Consortium News, they're not like some secret Russia-funded website. They're a legitimate grassroots. I mean, these are independent Mint Press. These are independent outlets. So what's going on there? Why hasn't there been an explanation? What we can say is that it is very likely that some division within the FBI or the Treasury Department has chosen to monitor and target these sites and pushed PayPal to do this. We at the Gray Zone, we haven't faced any censorship or block from PayPal, but after Donald Trump ordered the assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the second most important political official in Iran, we started getting transactions blocked by PayPal. If someone would say to us, for example, great work on Iran, or thank you for what you wrote about Soleimani, or something like that, those words would automatically trigger a block. Wow. So we know those mechanisms have been put in place in the past by PayPal under political pressure, and we're seeing it again, but we need answers from PayPal. And honestly, we need a movement. We need a transpartisan or nonpartisan movement of alternative media outlets and influencers and journalists against tech censorship and against the forces behind the tech censorship, like the Tech Transparency Project, which is funded by intelligence cutouts like the Open Society Foundations and the Omidyar Network. They need to be exposed and protested. Department of Homeland Security, it's right here in DC. Where's the protest against the Disinformation Governance Board? I mean, I haven't seen much in terms of protest activity in this city. And before we go to Patreon questions, just something I've been noticing around DC is there are Ukrainian flags everywhere. Actually, I was walking through the affluent commercial district of Georgetown 2 days ago, and there are Ukrainian flags draped across an entire street, which means in the monolithically white affluent areas of DC where decisions are made and the profits from those decisions are reaped, there is a total consensus in support of the NATO proxy war, and the streets are completely empty of protests except for whatever's going on at the Supreme Court, which has nothing to do with this war or the $33 billion, twice the Department of Interior's budget, that is being dumped into the arms industry and into further colonizing the Ukrainian state.
What do you recommend for people trying to start working independent or alternative media? What do you think has been the greatest achievements of the Gray Zone, and what do you hope to improve upon?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm trying to improve upon this studio. I think, I want to be live streaming more regularly and doing so in a slightly more professional way, so people can kind of depend on us more as a regular stream of analysis and journalism. The Gray Zone is a personal achievement for me because I started this site one day on WordPress and have been editing everything that appears on the site, writing as much as I can, and working with others to develop it into what it is. And so we're clearly making an impact. I see when people attack us, they use Gray Zone as a stand-in for challenging the narrative of U.S. foreign policy. Of course, they frame it as a conspiratorial stand-in, but we've become a brand and that exists in a rent-free fashion in the minds of our antagonists. That's a huge achievement. But the most important thing we've been able to do is doing investigative and field journalism, the real kind of classic journalism that I came up doing in a completely independent forum and forcing the other side to respond. And when I say the other side, I mean, we've come under attack from State Department funded websites through State Department organized campaigns. And that continues to this day with these attempts to get us censored and removed from Patreon and YouTube. And there are other great sites and outlets doing really important work. And when you look at Mint Press, for example, that was completely the initiative of Manar Adli, or Consortium News. That was completely created through the initiative of Robert Parry, the late, great Robert Parry, who used to work in mainstream media and was able to expose Iran-Contra and realized there was no space left in not just mainstream media, but progressive media for doing this kind of work. And that was kind of the conclusion I came to around 2017, 2018. And so here we are. And I think it's important for everyone watching to recognize that you can do this too. You just have to be willing to do actual journalism. Op-eds don't cut it. Rants don't cut it. And yeah, podcasts like, or live streams like Primo Radical are really important. I mean, you have great guests, you ask really good questions. It's an important part of the mix, but you can do what we're doing at the Gray Zone too. It's not very hard to do. It just takes a lot of initiative. Everybody in the corporate media is calling PayPal.
Right.
That's because the corporate media, they actually know this is taking place and they support it. I mean, that's what they're there for. I mean, that's such a great question. We should have done a whole podcast on it. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I need to, if I had more time, I would, write my thoughts down in the form of an essay or a report, because it needs to be addressed. I mean, more than Konstantin Kisin, who I'm not that familiar with, you have Julia Ioffe, who's a post-Soviet Jew who has sort of made her name by being a complete stenographer for US empire and its liberal wing. And so that speaks to the mentality of a lot of post-Soviet Jews in the United States, where the US has become their Israel, and the way that they want to assimilate and advance their ambitions is by being imperial propagandists. And, Julia Ioffe was actually the head of the Students for Israel Society at Princeton. She organized protests in support of the apartheid wall while she was at Princeton, but she never talks about Israel. Like, you'll never hear her talk about it because it's gotten so ugly there. You have Netanyahu and Trump really lifting the mask on the fascism that was always there. And so Ukraine under Zelensky, for like liberal Zionists in the United States and who have always formed an important bastion within US media and intelligentsia, Ukraine is kind of like the new Israel that they can support. Their and many of them claim to have roots there. For example, part of my family came from Ukraine over 100 years ago, but they would have been, if they had stayed, slaughtered by the Ukrainian partisan army and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which is effectively their acolytes are in charge of Kiev right now. And they fail to make that connection, partly because of Zelensky and partly because of their deep investment in US empire. And through their deep investment in US empire and their desire to show, to assimilate in the United States, they have to show their hostility to Russia. They have to flaunt their hostility to Russia, which in the American imagination is indistinguishable from Soviet Russia. So they've taken a harshly anti-Russian line and a harshly anti-communist line and wound up embracing a government that officially honors the murderers of Jews through some of the worst pogroms witnessed in Europe during World War II. The Lvov pogrom, for example, was one of the worst. There are photos you can see if you just Google Lvov pogrom, one particularly heinous one of a woman attempting to run away from a Ukrainian partisan army death squad that was driving her out of the city right before she's shot. I mean, this was the Holocaust of bullets. They were shot right above open graves and just thrown in with dirt piled over their heads. And the head of the Ukrainian partisan army, Roman Shukevich, he's a hero in Ukraine today. He's officially honored. There are streets named after him, stadiums named after him. Bandera, he is the hero of Zelensky's Ukraine. Zelensky has even said that it's normal and cool for people to admire Bandera. So this really highlights the hypocrisy of so many Jewish liberals in the media right now who are just cheerleading Ukraine. And I mean, it's one thing to oppose Russia's operation in Ukraine, Russia's war, but these people are cheerleading Ukraine. They're salivating over Zelensky, and they're putting Ukrainian flags on their Twitter avatar, next to their Twitter avatars, and hanging up Ukrainian flags over their homes, and just denying the continued specter of Banderism over Ukraine and the presence of actual neo-Nazis at the forefront of this fight. It's so disgusting and infuriating. And another thing, you know, some of the people doing this, Jeffrey Goldberg, former Israeli prison guard, who's the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, they've called me anti-Semites in the past. They've called me an anti-Semite for basically defending the rights of Palestinians who just completely ignored when the bombs fall on their homes every few years in Gaza and Washington. No one has Palestinian flags, but they called me an anti-Semite. They called me a capo. They called me a self-hating Jew. I'm always on these lists of anti-Semites and self-hating Jews that the pro-Israel lobby cooks up. And they're supporting neo-Nazis. They're supporting literal neo-Nazis. And they're supporting Zelensky, who is at the forefront of a government that has neo-Nazis in official positions. Vadim Troyan, for example, of Right Sector. He's an advisor to the police department in Kiev. Can go on and on. Who's the capo? Who's the self-hater? Who's the anti-Semite? I mean, everything feels upside down.